Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Center, sponsored by Small Church Connections. And this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. And today we have another guest, one that I'm sure you're going to find very interesting. I enjoy it that I get to speak with a maritime colleague, I guess I'll call it. And I out here in Saskatchewan have had beautiful rain today. What's your day looking like?
Right now, it's sort of overcast and humid, but I'm not complaining.
That sounds great. We're not complaining. We had a bit of rain that just sort of, I got rid of that forest fire feel here. By the way, I should introduce who our guest is today. I'll let you do that yourself. What's your name and what's your ministry journey been like?
Okay. Well, I'm Glenn Wooden. I'm Dr. Glenn Wooden because
doctor,
of
yeah.
the focus of this. So I'm living in the Annapolis Valley. So right now I'm at a cottage, which is on the Minas Basin. It's a beautiful place to have. My ministry journey started in my home church, actually. I became a Christian between grades 11 and 12. And I felt a call to ministry, and I asked my pastor what I could do. So I went to visitation and evangelizing through that first year of my Christian life. And then I went to Bible college. I did 2 years of 2 years of college. Mm-hmm. And beginning in my second year, I started working as a youth worker. And then through my various degrees, I've attracted a number of degrees for reasons. Yeah. I have been ministering part-time for most of my educational process, which was 2 years college, BA, MA, MDiv. And so during that, I was very focused on my call to ministry. Mm-hmm. The second year of my MDiv, I was asked if I would teach languages. I have an undergraduate degree in classical and New Testament Greek, so I was known to be somebody who could handle languages. And I was asked if I would teach. And it was at that point that I began to sense a call to a teaching ministry. Mm-hmm. And I don't see it as a greater or lesser. I moved from pastoral ministry focus into teaching ministry focus. And at Acadia Divinity College, where I teach, the emphasis has always been on, we're not here merely as academics for the academy, but we're here really for the church. Right. And that's been part of what has shaped me. So I've continued in ministry, and I've pastored small churches. Mm-hmm. And when I was away in Scotland doing my doctoral research, I was asked to speak at a number of small churches there, some of them regularly. And returning. When we came back in 93 for me to take up my full-time position, we looked around as a family, and we checked out some of the larger congregations. And in each of the large congregations, I would hear, well, we've got one of them, literally at the time, between faculty, retired people on staff, 36 ministers here. So it's 36. A great place to be, 36.
Yeah, it's in the university. A small church in itself, yeah.
Yeah, it's in a university town, so that's the reason for it. But in the midst of that, we decided, no, let's have a look around, because we wanted a place where we could use our gifts. Mm-hmm. My wife grew up in a small church. I grew up in a city church, but we wanted a place where we could use our gifts. So we actually went back to the first church that I had ever pastored solo. A small country church at the time. And that's where we are till today, from 93 until today. And so my ministry journey has taken me from being called to pastoral ministry, which was a very clear call, to this call to a teaching ministry. I think that's where God wanted me to be, but when I was called to pastoral ministry, I had no idea what university professors were. I didn't grow up in that context. So it was God's way of getting me where God wanted me. That's how I describe
it. My brother has a very similar movement from having gone through in his undergrad as a math person, then deciding that he's been called into ministry, goes into ministry and finds out that he's really a teacher and ends up teaching Greek at Tyndale and a few other places. So yeah, it's an interesting journey. So you're in a small church now. What type of things, you talked about your giftings and all that. What type of things are you doing in a small church?
Well, I do whatever we need.
That sounds like a small church.
That's a small church.
Yeah.
I believe in the priesthood of all believers. And so one of the things that I have stressed ever since we've come there, and after I got my doctorate and beyond, I'm never to be addressed as the Reverend Dr. Glenn Wooden or Dr. Glenn or Dr. Wooden, because in church, I'm a believer worshiping with others. Yeah. So our congregation has a wide variety of people. We go from people who are in social assistance up to, there's one guy who has a PhD and teaches Old Testament at seminary.
My goodness.
Yeah. But we have nurses, business owners, people who are in government. So it's a small church.
What would you call a small church? How large would it be then?
I like to say how small is it, because
okay.
there are large churches, there are small churches, and there are tiny churches.
Right. Okay.
And so before COVID, it would be 20 to 30 on a Sunday. And after COVID, to this point, people are still timid. It's a 10 to 20 on a Sunday. So it's small. What do I do? I wrote down some of the things that I do. I've been a Sunday school teacher, both children and adults, a junior church leader. I've been a trustee. I am a deacon. I'm a preacher when we need preachers, or when somebody can't come, I fill in. And as much as I tell people I'm not the Reverend Dr. Glenn Wooden, I'm just here. I do understand my role. I'm ordained. And so when we're without a pastor, or if we have a student pastor, which often we do, then I will step in. So I do funerals, I do weddings, I've done crisis situations. So sort of a jack of all trades. And since COVID, well, a little bit before that, but mostly since COVID in a more intense way, I'm also the tech guy. So I record all of our services, and I put them up on YouTube. And I'm also I help out with music. So I'm one of the music leaders. So if there's something to be done, basically, I get to help out in doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well,
small church.
Yeah, that does sound like small church. Yeah. Sounds like my journeys too. Yeah. Music, tech. Yeah, all that fun. Mm-hmm. Okay. So on the side though, you serve as a professor at a divinity school. Okay, sort of more than on the side. Oh, how does what you teach lead you to speak well of the small church and ministry in a small church?
Well, first of all, I think, and it's been the sort of the culture of Acadia Divinity College, that people who are faculty have to be rooted in a congregation. That is one of the things that is a requirement for us. Shouldn't have to be, but it sort of is. There it is. We have to be. It's part of who we are. And I think of it as it keeps us rooted in ministry. Yeah. Because my specialty in Old Testament is Septuagint studies, and we can get very, very esoteric, and it can have absolutely nothing to do with anything to do with theology or ministry. And we don't really want that as the kind of people who are teaching people going into ministry. They need to have some rooting. So for me, it keeps me rooted. And that then helps me to think about what it is I'm teaching and why I'm teaching it. For me, what my studies and my place as a professor of Old Testament languages does is it keeps me reminded that there's nowhere in the Bible that God says we have to be big. Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the themes throughout scriptures is, you think you want to be big? Let me show you how small you can be. So I think of that, and I'll give some few examples here in a moment, but I also think God has this long-term view, and that's one of the things the Old Testament sort of pulls out for us. God has a long-term view. God doesn't have to get things fixed right now. And what seems like nothing now can become something major later on. So God has this long time view, and I don't need to worry. And that was something I learned in ministry. I don't need to worry about fixing all the problems. I need to do what I can. God has a long-term view, and I'll let God take care of all the other stuff at some point. But for me in the Old Testament, one of the things that it brings out is that God chooses the not obvious. And that has been a good reminder for me time and time again. We have students come through, and we'll all, as naturally, we'll do sort of a mental evaluation and think to ourselves, I'll think to myself, boy, I think that person's called somewhere else. They get out and they get into a ministry, and wow, did God ever smash my stereotypes of what should be? So years of teaching have taught me that I need to just keep those human opinions to myself. But in the Old Testament, I think of Abraham, who was a nobody. He really was a nobody. He was a guy. He wasn't a leader. He didn't have a country. God chose Abraham and began his process with that. I like Deuteronomy 7:6-9. This is where God reminds them. He says, and I'm going to read it here, Yahweh, your God, has chosen you out of all the people of the earth to be his people for his treasured possession. It was not because you were more numerous. It was because, and I've skipped some text there, it was because Yahweh loved you and kept the oath that he had sworn to your ancestors. God chose them because God chose them. And they weren't large, they weren't a huge nation, but God chose them in Abraham, and then God is using them and has been using them for his ministry to the earth. And I think of Gideon. We all like that story of Gideon when he's, gather the troops together and he gets 32,000. Well, no, let's cut it down to, tell the ones who don't want to be here to leave. And so we're down to 10,000, still too many. Let's cut it down more, 300. He brings 32,000 and he's left with 300. Well, that's just absolutely absurd. That's not a military strategy, which of course was God's point. So that is a theme through scripture. But what I have used over many years with small churches is I have used the material from when they return from exile. So there are three texts, if I could focus on them. And if you want to ask questions in the midst of that, you go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I'm formulating some right now.
Okay, good. When they return from exile, they land there. The first group lands there, and they put down the footings for the new temple at some point. And then we read in Haggai and Zechariah that there's a period of about 14 years where they don't get around to it. And
they're kind of busy doing nothing. Yeah.
Well, Haggai, you've got your paneled houses. And so, they had to have homes and businesses. But they had forgotten. So God sends Zechariah and Haggai. And they begin to rebuild the temple. And it is Ezra chapter 3, verses 10-13 is the bit that I like. They lay the foundation, and then they all gather. And we're told that those who had seen the former temple, when they saw this temple, they wept because it wasn't anything like the former one. But then you have the other ones, the young ones who had been born in exile, they're coming back. They see it and they say, finally, we've got a temple, and they're rejoicing. That's a text that I see that with small churches. We look, especially for churches that used to be large, we look to the past and we think, oh, that's what we were. Look at what we are now. This is nothing.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas those who are coming to faith are saying, wow, I've got a congregation. This is wonderful. We're worshiping. But then I want to read some from two texts. One's from Haggai, one's from Zechariah, because these tie into exactly the same text in Ezra chapter 3. So in Haggai, the Lord says, who is left among you that saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Is it not as nothing in your sight? Yet now take courage, O Zerubbabel. So he's the political leader. Take courage, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Take courage, all you people of the land, says Yahweh. Work, for I am with you, says Yahweh of hosts. So he speaks to them and says, you think it's nothing. Well, it's not nothing. And he goes on to say, work, for I am with you, says Yahweh of hosts, according to the promise that I made with you when you came out of Egypt. My spirit abides among you. Do not fear. And then Zechariah, the other prophet that God calls to get them moving on building the temple. Zechariah chapter 4, verses 6 to 10. I'm not reading all of it, just bits of it. This is one that many of us know. This is the word of Yahweh to Zerubbabel, the political leader, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. And that's not about, charismatic anything. We put all kinds of things on that. That was about, you've got to get the temple built.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. My spirit's with you. So, and then he says at the end of that passage, for whoever has despised the day of small things shall rejoice, and when they shall see the plummet, the line for measuring things in the hand of Zerubbabel. These three passages for me are something that I have preached in a number of contexts, and I tell my students about. God doesn't care how big we are, and God doesn't care what resources we have. And Haggai says, I own all of the gold everywhere, and I can shake that out. And if you need money, I will get it for you. You just be faithful with what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And that's what we read in Deuteronomy when he tells them, I didn't choose you because, you're great or you're large. I chose you because I chose you, and you just need to be faithful. And if we're faithful, God takes care of the rest.
Okay, you've touched on very interestingly a passage that I have heard preached in the last little while by other preachers. Talking with Ron Clausen recently in one of these podcasts, he also mentioned the idea of a small theology, which is to say, let's get over the fame and fortune of largeness or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so that whole thing comes out, and we're starting to re-preach the exile, I suppose, or coming out of the exile. Where do you see us preaching right now that would be important for the church to move to what aren't we doing that we should be doing? Maybe that's the question that I'm asking.
And are you thinking of church or small church?
I'm thinking small church particularly, but overall, I'm sure it impinges on the overall large church.
Yeah. Yes, and I agree with that because I think the things that are important are things that are important for all congregations. It's just a matter of how do we do ministry, how much resources do we have, how many things do we have to do it. But the basic focus of ministry is the same in all contexts, large and small. I think we've got to get over some of our modern ways of thinking.
Okay.
And by that, I mean, as the church in North America and in Western Europe, we are very materialistic and scientific in our understanding of what we need to value in the world. If we can touch it and if we can count it, it's something to begin to be valued. And if there's more, then that's better. That's very materialistic and very scientific. If we can count it, it means something. It's valuable. Yeah. So, I mean, we see that with numbers, how many people are in a church on Sunday, how large is the budget. And we judge what's good based upon the numbers, and that society values numbers and values a lot. If we have a lot of money in the budget, that's success. If we have a lot of bums on the pews, sorry for that, but if we have a lot of people on our pews, then that's success because we can count and it's a big number. I'm not against big, but when the focus is on the numbers and on counting, that really is a materialistic Western understanding of what's valued.
Right.
And I don't think that's helpful. So in a small church context, I think we need to stop doing that, which is hard because we're part of this society. We need to stop the counting. We need to stop the comparing. So we like to compare, balance sheets and record attendances. What we need to be focusing on is who do we have and what has God gifted the people we have to do. So I think we need to be focusing on what are people's spiritual gifts and natural gifts, and how can we use those? Because what I've experienced over years, talking with small church pastors, people in small churches, even in my own church, is we keep looking to the future when we're going to be a real church. Mm-hmm. When, well, this is a ministry we could do right here if we had the people. So when we have the people, we'll do it, or we'll burn out the people that we do have doing something that would take twice the number of people. That for me is, I think, true for all congregations. We need to do what God has gifted us to do. And if we don't have the gifts to do it, we don't do it and don't worry about it.
Yeah. I'm just reading a book by a fellow by the name of Dr. Rick Hindmarsh, whom I met many, many years ago and became friends with, working with a whole area of, in his practice, he was a psychologist, worked with addictions and many other things, came to the realization that resilience, and that's really what he's talking about. His book is called Godly Grit. Yep. Resilience is not about numbers, as you're saying. It's about who you are, and being all that God created you to be, and using your gifts and giftings and calling. It seems to me small churches should be able to do that. I mean, we should recognize fairly quickly that when you've got 30 people, you can't do everything. So you have to focus on the people and not the programs necessarily. Am I out to lunch on that, or?
I think that is the point. And I think you're right on that. I've experienced of both kinds of small churches, mm-hmm. churches that have begun small. If they feel comfortable with themselves, they're comfortable, and they're not worried about things they're ministering. But if they come out of the larger Christian culture, a small church begins, and we'll be a real church when we grow up and we have a number of people.
Right.
And then there are the large churches that, as they shrunk, they still have the constitution and the committees and all the expectations for all the stuff they're going to do, but they don't have the people for that. Yeah. And they don't think or don't want to reassess and figure out, well, what's the good way for a small congregation to function? So I see in both, we can have that problem of the big church being the real church and the small church not, and we need to get away from that focus. So if we can be happy with who we are, I think that's really important, because we can be then free to do what God has gifted us to do. We can be free to evangelize with the small number of people that there might be around. And if God adds to the church, God does. If God doesn't, we're happy doing the ministry that God has given to us and being faithful in that. So I think this sense of, the psychology that is problematic for small churches, I really think it is something that we need to learn to deal with. That because we're small does not mean we're inadequate.
Yeah, very much so. And a resilient. Sometimes I wonder if we've taken the term thriving and flourishing and all those. I wonder mm-hmm. if resilient maybe another description that we need to start talking about with a small church, because we recognize that it's not easy. Life is not easy, period. So how do we remain resilient, and which leads to the thriving and all of that. Boy, you've got my mind going so far that my questions are just sort of coming out kind of weird here. But yeah, it makes sense to sort of work with who you've got. Maybe that's where I'm sort of coming from or getting to. Yeah.
Well, if we don't work with who we've got, then we're not working, according to what God has gifted us to be.
Yeah.
Paul says to people, he says, you need to have a proper estimation of yourself.
Right. Yeah.
And that doesn't mean we shouldn't think either too grandly about ourselves. This is about the individual, nor should we think too belittling of ourselves.
Yeah.
Christian culture. Oh, no, it wasn't me. I that might have been a good message, but it was all the Lord. Well, no, the Lord gifted me to do that. And so if I put down my gift, then I have actually despised God's gift. And I think that's the case for the small church too. If we have 20 people, we shouldn't be trying to do what 30 could do.
Yeah.
That's not who we have. It's not who we are. And we have gifts for doing certain things, and we need to figure out creative ways of doing ministry with those gifts, not with the gifts that will come.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, you've got me with many more questions to ask, and I do try and keep this to about 30 minutes, and we're almost there. So this has gone fairly quickly. Okay. So where I'm currently at, I'm doing an interim thing, and we're looking for new pastor. They're going to come into a church under 50. If you were to speak to someone who wanted to move into that, leading a small church, whether as pastor or as a lead elder or whatever term you may use, is there any advice that you'd want to give that person moving into the small church as the leader?
Yeah, I've done this for many years because most students coming through see themselves going out leading a large church.
Yeah.
The reality is that's not going to happen.
Nope.
So I've actually taken it as part of what I do, as part of my role, to promote small churches and remind people about that. For many, many years, I've told them the first thing they need to do when they're called to a new ministry, whatever kind, but especially small churches, they need to exegete the context. I'm a biblical studies scholar, so exegesis is important. But exegeting your context is really quite important.
Did you say execute or exegete your client?
No, don't execute them yet. That's not good for church growth.
Okay. No, that's yeah.
So sort of sussing out what is the sense of this congregation. People who read small church literature know that, there's the official structure, and then there's work that gets done out in the parking lot or in somebody's living room. Yeah. So you need to know what the structures are. You need to know who the real decision makers are. And I encourage students, get Stats Canada information on your community. A friend of mine, former student friend, he was in the church and he said, well, I want to go across the street, literally across the street to the school and start a ball game, indoor soccer or something for the local kids. And the deacon said, well, there are no kids. Well, there was a school right across the street. Yeah. First of all, that's problematic. But they just didn't see. So he got Stats Canada information. And it was revealing for the congregation just how many young families there were. Yeah. We can be so narrowly focused as church people that we don't see that larger community that's not coming to church, and we don't know what the makeup is. I think we need to exegete the context.
Mhm.
within the congregation, but also outside the congregation. Don't make any big plans for your first year. Don't come with your 5 steps for how you're going to solve this church's problems so that in 5 years' time, we're going to triple in size. Come and listen and hear where the people's heartbeat is and see what the community's heartbeat is before you do anything. And I think we need to assess giftedness. I really think we need to be looking at what are the natural gifts, but also what are the spiritual gifts that people have. Because in line with what I said before, I don't think we should be doing things that we don't have the gifts to be doing. Okay. If we're doing what we can with what we have and people come to the Lord, then we can continue to expand that ministry. But we shouldn't be trying to do poorly because we don't have the skills to do it, things that would be nice to do. I think we need to assess what our spiritual and natural gifts are in the congregation and figure out from there what can we do. And I think pastors going into small congregations need to help them to deal with the inferiority complex that we've talked about. I think I say we need to help to build up the small church's self-esteem. And I'm not talking here about, we need to feel proud about we're small and we're good. Right? Big is bad. No. We're small and we're okay with who we are right now. And we're just focusing on our ministry. We need to get that sense of we're okay. We don't need to feel the pressure of comparing ourselves to the large churches around. So those are the kinds of things that I advise students to do who are going out, who want to minister in a small church context. You really have to listen very carefully. And I think we need to do a better job on encouraging the small church and saying just what God says to the people of Israel after the exile. You think this small thing is something to be despised or not worthy? Well, let me tell you, that's not the case. Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that I tell students.
Okay, my timer says we're done.
Okay,
but we may have to do this again. Just I really appreciate Glenn your spending time and speaking from your heart. This has been great. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
All right, thanks, Glenn.
Okay, thanks, Ron.